arc.com, and he also likes to have fun hula hooping. We did that on. Sorry?
Yeah, it's my favorite.
Yeah, it's his favorite. And he's gonna start his talk, and afterwards, if you guys have questions, you can we can discuss further. And I know Marcelo is not here, but I just wanted to officially thank Selina and Marcelo for hosting us. Give it up for Kevin.
Thank you. First off, thank you all for coming. Thank you for the lovely welcome, Olivia. This topic is of great interest, I think, to all of us. But before we start, I want to lay out a few caveats so that you all know where I'm coming from and we're all on the same page. First off, this is a talk. I'm going to be running through a few slides, not too many, and I'll be delivering some information that's helpful, hopefully. But I also want it to be a conversation. So, if you have a pressing question or something you want to ask before we get to the end, that's all right. If you have a comment, something like that, it's fine. These are all ideas I've been playing around with for quite some time, and I find them very interesting, so engagement is welcome. And then secondly, I wanted to make a note about life coaching, which I throw some shade at here in the title of the presentation, but I wanted to draw a clear line about what kind of life coaching I'm talking about when I say that it's not desirable. The implication here is that life coaching is not really a good thing, right? How you be your own life coach means you don't have to have a life coach. But I think it really depends on what you mean by life coaching. I think that sometimes when people are looking for a life coach, what they're looking for is a surrogate decision maker, someone who can tell them what to do in the absence of them knowing what they need to do themselves. I think when you're looking for a life coach in that sense, that you may be going down a blind alley that can lead you into trouble. And if you find someone who actually will support you in doing that, you've probably found someone who's fairly parasitic, right? Because what you want is somebody who's going to teach you to get better at making decisions for yourself, or teach you what the mechanisms that you can use are that help you, make yourself more capable of making decisions in the future. And so there are lots of life coaches like that. I know some. There are a few in the room. Yeah. But for those of you who are new to this topic, I think that it's important to understand why I think life coaching can have two sides to it, and why it's important to know what you're looking for when you go into it. Okay. So I'm going to start off with a very depressing slide. I promise it goes uphill from here. This is just a chart of suicides in the U.S. From 81, it's the year I was born, until 2016. And I think what you see is a sharp increase around 2001. So I think that this is actually something that you can partially ascribe to social media, right? The rise of like a new medium for communication, and some kind of the FOMO that you have when you see other people's lives lived out in a way that's much better than your own. But this also tracks, I think, a rise in just depression and the fact that people aren't really feeling very secure in what they're doing in life. And I think that's because we've been having only one side of a very two-sided conversation. And in the US, you may see that there's also there's also an opioid crisis. There's lots of things that are happening now that are indicative of the fact that people are feeling a lack of control over their own lives. And one of the interesting things about this is that the actual epicenter, one of the epicenters of this suicide epidemic is in Palo Alto, California, which is in Silicon Valley. It's like the heart of Silicon Valley. I think Facebook is there, or I know Google has offices there. Apple is right next door in Cupertino, and that's actually where I used to work. And so I was at Apple for 3 years, and while I was there, I was seeing not this trend, not suicide, but I was seeing what it was indicating. I was seeing the rise in depression, the rise in lots of people having jobs that they thought were the perfect job, that they had strived their whole lives to get, and then for some reason it wasn't really fulfilling them. Like they actually weren't able to.
Sorry.
No worries. I think there's a few. You guys can get up here as well. Yeah. Scooch in. I think there's someone right on the table here. Yeah. So when I was working there, what I was seeing was actually I was seeing this in the people I worked with. Like all the people I worked with were very happy to have the job, but not all of them were very happy in their lives and what they were doing. And they were actually feeling a deep sense of dissatisfaction in many of the key areas of their lives, the things that were most important. I worked with a guy who was on a team that was developing batteries, and he was like getting paid some ridiculous astronomical amount of money. He'd been living his whole life striving to get to that position, and he was miserable. His boss, he said, he took me in a meeting one day after the meeting, and I think he just needed somebody to talk to. And he said, my boss is a monster. And I was like, man, that's rough. If you have to work for a monster, that's not great for you. And he was telling me, he doesn't get to see his kids, he doesn't get to see his family, he spends all his time at work, and he wasn't finding any kind of balance. So that's one kind of balance, right? There's a work-life balance. But what he was talking about was the fact that he had gotten to this position because he had been following what he thought was the right thing to do, but obviously didn't connect with what was the most valuable to him. And describe nomads as well. They're very similar in the traits that they have in common with tech workers, right? It's just people who are in situations where they do something atypical, right? Because working in tech is atypical in the sense that very few people can get those jobs. And choosing a job like this for yourself is atypical in that it takes some real guts and creativity and openness to get there. But because of that, I think that sometimes the people who are in the professions like these that we've chosen tend to fall into some of the same traps. And that's why I think it's important for us especially to know what the pitfalls are and maybe how to stay out of them. I think actually in the Nomad group the other day, there was a post by someone who said, it was a Lisbon Nomad group, they said, has anybody else had trouble, done really well managing their career, but had trouble in their personal life, or had trouble getting themselves, feeling good about themselves personally, or taking care of themselves? And, excuse me, and that's, I think, fairly common. If one person is writing a post like that, you can bet there's 50 other people who are thinking it, or who are dealing with it, or struggling with it. So it's a real problem, and I think that all of us to some degree recognize that there's something not quite in sync with what it is that we're doing, or how we're doing it. So I think that this is the reason why life coaching is on the rise. And I think it's on the rise in both of those two communities. You see in California, in the Bay Area, lots of life coaches popping up. You see it here in the Nomad community. We see even more of it because we're kind of on the forefront of those kind of careers that are like new spaces. And so I think that that's not just because I've been in both those communities. I think it actually is because there's something that is common across both of them. So that's important. And I think another thing that's not up here, but that I would add, is that these groups tend also to be very interested in nonfiction. So I promise that'll come back into play towards the end, but that's important, right? It's just these people tend to be focused on how they can better themselves, how they can improve, onward and upward, right? Books that can give me something that I can use for my career or whatever it is. And so nonfiction is also a focus. But I think that when people fall into those traps, they tend to, they feel trapped once they start to not be able to actually do the things they want to do. So like the colleague I told you about at his job, he was obviously feeling trapped. And so this is the part that I want to try to break down a little bit for all of you. This is like kind of the meat of the presentation. I want to talk about what it is to feel trapped. I want to actually define it and break it down a little bit, and then talk about what are some ways of getting out of it consistently, because I think those are the things that people struggle with. And that's why they feel like they need a life coach. They feel like they need someone to help guide them. So when you look at someone who's trapped like this dude, there's three things that usually go into it, I think. So one is people who don't see any possibilities, right? So if you don't see any possibilities, you can't figure out where to go, and so you're trapped. That's pretty common. The other one is uncertainty. So people are uncertain, even if they see possibilities, they're not sure which direction they want to move in. Right? Because there's a million things you could do. You could be doing a million things at any moment. Some of them are extremely dangerous. Some are pretty safe. Some are actually somewhere in the middle. And some of those actually might be good for you, but some of them might not be. And figure out which of those paths to take is very, very hard. And so feeling uncertain is very common for people who are feeling trapped. And the third piece is stagnation. So I think we're all familiar with the fact of, or the idea that even if you know where to go, right, you've picked a direction, you say, okay, I think the best thing to do is do this. Then you start to go do it. And that's really hard because there's fear, right? And fear is pushing against your desire to move forward. And so that's a big barrier for a lot of people. And so those three elements in combination, right, are the essence of feeling trapped. And so all those three things have something in common, I think. And what they have in common is the solution to them. because the solution to all three of those problems is inspiration. Okay, I'm looking around because I'm looking for like head shakes and like people getting annoyed because like, oh God, this is what I came here for? I'm gonna get a talk about inspiration? That's how I would feel if I was giving a talk, if I was listening to a talk like this, because inspiration is such a cliche, overused term. Everyone talks about inspiration, you have to get it, you have to have it, you have to use it, do things with it, but no one ever talks about what it actually is and gives you a reason that you should, one, do those things, but also tells you how to do those things. So I'm gonna talk a little more about inspiration, but first off, I wanna talk about what it does, right? So think about those three elements of being trapped, right? You don't see possibilities. If you don't see possibilities, it's because you're not inspired. If you're feeling inspired, then you see possibilities. That's kind of the definition of inspiration. It starts to open up the world of possibilities to you, right? And so, same thing, if you're uncertain, right? If you start to feel inspired, it gives you a sense of what direction you should be moving in. Yeah, so you have all these myriad things you could do, and you have maybe 10 paths ahead of you. If you want to find one that's actually going to sustain you, usually the one that inspires you is something that calls out to you. It like glitters, right? You see something and you're like, that would be inspiring, and you go in that direction. So it does give you information to move out of the uncertainty trap. And stagnation, right? Same thing. So stagnation is just the fact that you have fear like pushing against you, right? So fear is a funny thing because fear is not something that you ever have to work to manifest. Fear just arises constantly. It's always there. You don't have to think really hard and like be like, oh, let me try to be afraid. All you have to do is think about something that's hard to do and you're afraid immediately, right? So, but inspiration works in opposition to that. In fact, it's the only thing that works in opposition to that, right? Because if you're inspired, it pushes you against your fear to move towards the things that are scary for you. And so it's really important, even though it is a cliche, right? But it is still something that's very real and that you can use. And so if you have inspiration, it gets you out of traps, right? Because all three of those things are mitigated by inspiration. It's basically the antidote to being trapped, right? It's the way out, I think. So if we want to talk about what inspiration is, actually, hold on a second. If we want to talk about what inspiration is, I think that another thing to remember about it is that it's non-spontaneous. So all those things that I was just mentioning, right? Like fear being something that just is there all the time. It's like a rock. It's solid. But inspiration is not something you can just call up. You know, you can't just manifest inspiration whenever you need it. You can't just say, you know what, I don't feel like going to work today, but let me get some inspiration going, and then just do it, right? If you could, well, you'd be able to make a lot of money because you'd be able to market that. You also wouldn't be here listening to me talk. So inspiration is one of those things you can't just manifest. The same as happiness, right? You can't just aim for, and you can't aim for it either, because it's an epiphenomenon. It's a secondary phenomenon. So inspiration occurs when something happens. Same as happiness occurs when something happens. You can't just aim for the happiness itself because it comes out of something else. It comes out from you doing the things that make you happy. And so inspiration is the same. It comes out of you doing the things that cause you to be inspired. So we're going to talk about what some of those things are. But first we'll talk about what inspiration actually is. So everybody knows what tuning forks are? Any musicians? Yeah, okay. Tuning forks, right? How do they work? Resonance. Right? So resonance is basically the idea that two things can vibrate at the same frequency, even if they're not connected, right? So if you have one tuning fork vibrating at a certain frequency, the other one will vibrate in sympathetic manner with that. And so that's the idea of resonance in like the physical world. But we also talk about resonance with people, with ideas, with stories. We know that resonance is also a phenomenon that maps onto our lives. So resonance basically is emotion, right? Emotion is the manifestation of resonance. And this is a little complicated, but it's not too far-fetched. So think about the fact that when you have emotions, right, it's basically a reflection of something that's happening in the world. Most of your emotions tend to be a response to something that's going on. So you see something that you're afraid of, or let's say you see something that is dangerous, right, that has a potential to hurt you. That resonates with you in a way that is like fear. So the emotion is fear. But it's still resonance, right? You're resonating with a pattern that's outside of yourself. You see a tiger in the corner of this room, immediately, fear, right? If you see something that is of benefit to you, like potentially helpful, then you feel interest, right? Or you may even feel happiness, depending on what it is. And so resonance is basically the phenomenon of the outside world mapping onto you in some way, right? Something inside of you is vibrating in sync with whatever's happening outside of you. And so that's what emotion basically is. That's a simplistic definition. It's not exact. If there were scientists in here, they would punch me in the face. But it's good enough for our purposes right now. So inspiration then, the question is, what is inspiration? Because inspiration is an emotion, right? But the question then is, what are we resonating with when we feel inspiration? Do I have any ideas?
No, I was wanted to ask about, because passion, like, I would say it's passion, not the inspiration. Because some people can be passionate about something they're doing, not necessarily being inspired by somebody.
Yeah.
You know?
But if you're feeling passionate about something, you're generally inspired to work on that thing. If you're passionate about a project, then you feel inspired to work on it, right? I think there's a few things that combine into one when you talk about inspiration.
Maybe because I'm not English speaker, I don't know. Just my perspective of inspiration. It's like it's something that you have to be inspired. It's like you watch something, or like it's not coming out of you. It's coming from outside.
Yeah, well, like I said, I think what it is, and think about it this way: if there's something that's happening outside of you, then the way you relate to it can be in an inspiring manner, right? So it's not necessarily the outside thing itself. Like if you're inspired by a person, they are not inspiration. The inspiration is something that's interactive. It's the emotion that happens between you and that thing. And passion is similar also. You can feel passionate about something outside of yourself as well. It's a slightly different emotion, and I think it's tied to something else. But when we talk about inspiration, I think what it is, did anybody want to venture a guess about what? So like I said, you see something outside of yourself that's can harm you, that's fear. What's the thing that you see that causes inspiration?
Something that you like, something that you value.
That's exactly right. Did you cheating?
No.
No, that's exactly right. It's something that you value. I think, something that you like, maybe, but definitely something that you value, something that's important to you. So when you see reflections of your values, something that is important to you, that causes inspiration. That causes inspiration to kind of spontaneously occur. And so when you think about what inspiration is, when people are talking about that, it's basically the emotion that's attached to what you value. So it's the emotion that basically when you value something, forces you to move towards it or try to emulate it. So it's similar to admiration in that way. It's like an emotion that has a motive force. It pushes you forward, just like I was saying, it pushes against fear. Inspiration has some power to actually push you in some way. So what's pushing you towards is your values. Okay. So the question then is, what do you value? I like this quote a lot. I found this quote just recently, perusing the internet. So it's not hard to make decisions once you know what your values are. That might not make sense outside of this framework, right? If you're not thinking about things like inspiration, about what it actually does for you, about what values are, and how you make decisions, right? Then this might seem like a little bit of a hodgepodge of words. It rings true, but maybe you wouldn't be able to say exactly why. But decisions, right? That's what we were talking about when we said uncertainty. So when you're uncertain, which is when you're feeling trapped, making decisions is the pain point. And the way to overcome that, the thing that helps you get over it, is to know what your values are, according to Roy Disney. That's Walt Disney's older brother, by the way. So he was like integral in forming the Disney Corporation. But the question then is, right, what do you value? Yeah, what do you value? Bless you. The question then is, what do you value? And when I say that, I mean, what do you truly, truly value? Because that's not as easy a question to answer. I think if you ask most people, what do you value? The answer may be something fairly simplistic, fairly common across most people. I value my family. I value my friends. And those are all correct answers. That's nothing wrong with that. But when I think about about what's important about what you value, it's not objects. It's something like traits, right? So there are traits that you value, and the things that you value reflect those traits back at you to some degree. So finding out what you value is is really important for all the reasons we've already talked about. But finding out what you truly value is much harder. And there's some things that what you value probably are not. And so one of them might be what you're taught to value. So all of us are taught to value certain things. Cultures are built around the idea that we can tell you what to value, and then you value those things, and it keeps our society together and cohesive, and it works to some degree. Look, we're all in this room together, no one's attacking each other. That's strange, that's not normal. Like, this is an odd thing to be happening for human beings, for any animal really. If you throw us all together, we have a common set of shared values, to some degree, right? And obviously each of us has very different individual values, but overall there's like a few that lie at the bottom of those things. So I'm not saying that those are bad to have shared values, but what you're taught is only a piece of the puzzle, because you're also an individual. You know, you're a part of a group, but you're also a person. And so what you value is probably going to be different than what you value. And they may have some overlap, but they're going to be very particular to you, very idiosyncratic to what's important. And so what you're taught can't be what you value, because it's not you, right? By definition, it's something from the outside. So it plays into it, but it's not the only thing. What your job tells you to value, that's another thing that people often tend to get caught up in. My colleague, who I was describing a while ago, obviously had spent many years replacing his own values with his company's values. And what it did was it made him amazing at his job. He was great. He was a great worker at the company. He made lots of money. But at the end of the day, he wasn't able to extract himself from the situation he got himself into when he realized it wasn't his actual choice. It didn't relate to his values. So your job has a very specific set of values. It's generally to push forward their bottom line, whatever that is. And it may coincide with what you care about, but it's not necessarily your values. And then, of course, there's friends and family, right? And friends and family definitely instill values in you. In fact, that's the traditional way that people get their values. And that also is not a bad thing, especially if your family has very good values. But at the same time, just because they've instilled it in you doesn't mean that you're in touch with what it actually is. And that's what I was saying earlier. If you have something outside of yourself, you know, like a person who you admire, what you're getting from them is the display of a pattern. Right? They're doing things that are making you feel something towards them. Now, if it's family, it's just you've got the love of having been with them for a very long time, so that's part of it. But generally speaking, it's something that they're doing, right? It's something that you can actually observe in what they're doing. It's not just the body of the person in front of you. And so, naming the person as the object of your inspiration or the object of your values is too short-sighted. There's more to it. So values are deeply personal. It's like something that you can only discover for yourself. And this is also, I think, the reason why, you know, when you look at a good life coach, for example, or a good therapist, or someone who's really out there to help you, they want to give you a temporary regimen of time for you to discern what it is that's important to you. What they're trying to get you to do is to come up with your own set of values, to articulate them so that you actually know what they are. Because until they're articulated, they're vague and they're muddy in your head, and you can't actually do anything about them. So it's important to get them nailed down, because then they have the motive force that I was talking about earlier, the force to push. So the question still is, how do you figure out what your values are? And the answer is, I think, and one of the answers is that you figure it out by looking to the emotion that is attached to value, and that's inspiration. So if you actually look to when you feel inspiration, it tells you something about what you value. It's one of the only ways to actually get in touch with what you value, because it's the most obvious. It's also involuntary. You know, like, you don't get to decide when you feel inspired or not. In fact, you can't, even if you try. And sometimes, actually, it happens when you don't want it to. You know, like, if you're inspired by something that is related to your values, and they're not values that you want to have, or they're values that tell you you have to do something that you don't want to do, that's annoying. Right? Because now you have something telling you that you should be doing something other than what you're doing. So for my friend at work, if he looked to his values, he would have found something about the fact that he needed to work a job that demanded less of him. And that might mean taking less pay. That might mean upsetting his entire structure of his life. And that's not an easy decision to make, especially when you've been doing it for 30 years. So it's not always a good thing, but it is something that tells you something about that will push you towards what will sustain you. So what are the things that inspire us consistently? You name anything? Name any things that inspire people consistently? Music, that's one. A lot of people are inspired by music. Podcasts, right? Podcasts for sure. Yeah.
Movies.
Movies, 100% movies for sure. All those things, well, aside from music, and music is weird. I'm not going to jump into that because that would take us down a rabbit hole that would go on for far too long. But podcasts, books, movies.
Nature.
Sorry?
Nature.
Nature, great. Nature's in the movie category. I'm sorry, in the music category. I'm going to put it, but that's definitely true, for sure. Yeah. So.
Keep getting to know people.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. So people. So it's true. People, right? That's the thing that all those things have in common, right? So podcasts, books, movies, all of them have people in common, and that makes sense because we're people, and so obviously when we look to what inspires us, that will have something to do with people generally. Music has something to do with people. Nature has something to do with people in that you're a conscious being experiencing it, right? So and the thing is when you're inspired by nature, you're inspired by what nature is doing to you, right? Nature is the pattern, and the resonance that you feel is inspiration. And so it's almost as much about you as it is about the nature. The fact that we all feel it just means that, well, we're all human. We're all somewhat similar. Some things affect us all the same way. Music, again, I think is in that same category. But people, for sure, is a source of inspiration. But it's not just people, right? Because when I talked about people earlier, I was saying there's a frame of a person, there's a human being, but that's not what we're inspired by. What we're inspired by is the pattern of actions that they produce, or can produce. So we're not inspired by the physical body of, let's say, Bill Gates, right? It came off a little weird. Well, maybe we're not. I don't know what your preferences are. But we are not inspired by that per se. What we're inspired by is what he's done, what he's accomplished. We're inspired by the story of Bill Gates. And so that's the thing that I think underlies what you're talking about. People, right?
Movies.
They have stories, movies, right? Story, podcasts even. Good podcasts always have a theme. They have a story to them. A lot of times people love podcasts that have people coming on and just telling their story. I was here, I did these things, and now I'm here. Sometimes they inspire you. Usually when they do something that, was outlandish or uncommon, or something that maps onto your experience of what you want out of your life. And so inspiration is other people. It's stories. It's the stories that other people generate through their actions in the world. Does that make sense so far?
And the emotions that those stories create in us.
Yeah, right. The resonance that you feel with the story. Yeah, right. And I'm going to go into this maybe a little more before the end, but the interesting thing about that resonance is that it's very particular to you. And you know that, but you also might think if you go see like a sappy movie, and everybody feels the same thing. Right? That may be true, but I think also that what you're feeling is based on something different than what other people are feeling. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I'm going to tell you a brief story about why I put this picture up here. So years ago, I was 2012 actually, and I had just left. I'd been living in China for 3 years. And I just left because I had been floundering. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, so I decided, you know what, I'm going to go back to grad school. As Olivia said, I was in the Air Force, so I had the GI Bill, so they would pay for some of your schooling. And so I said, okay, I should go back to school and start being a real person. I'm going to go do it. And so I did. I went back to California, and I got enrolled in a graduate program, and I was miserable. I was floundering. I had no idea how to be back in school again. I just had been out of school for so long, and I was sick of it from day one. I missed the first week of class because I went to Burning Man, which was awesome. But it also put me far behind in my schoolwork. And I also was coming from a very different place. You know, I'd been in China for a long time, and I hadn't, I didn't know anyone in the new school. I had a set group of friends back where I came from. I didn't have any social outlets where I was, and I was really feeling just out of sorts. My best friend actually, who I've known for years, was actually in town at one point, and we went to the movies. And we went to see this movie, Beast of the Southern Wild, which I don't know if any of you have seen. Have you seen that movie? Yeah. Yeah? Okay, cool. Well, I love that movie, but I didn't know it at the time. I just went in and I was like, okay, I don't know what this movie's about. There's a big pig, some horns. We'll see, it could be interesting. And so I went into the theater and I sat down and I watched the movie. And the movie turned out to be extremely, well, let's say, inspirational to me. What I watched play out really had an effect on me, a huge emotional effect. And it was like I said, it was unsolicited. It was one of those things I didn't plan for. I didn't necessarily want because I was in a movie theater with my best friend. And so after the movie was over, the lights come up and I had to get up really quickly. And my friend was like, well, let's watch the credits and let's talk about the movie. And I was like, no, I have to go. And so I went past him and I went to the bathroom and I went to one of the stalls. I closed it. And then I started bawling my eyes out. I was just like crying my face off about this movie. And it was the strangest thing to happen. Like I was actually laughing and crying at the same time. I was like, what is wrong with me? But everybody's had that experience, right? You watch a movie that's like really impactful to you, you hear a song or something, and it has this deep emotional impact on you. And that impact is resonance, right? That impact is resonance. And so here's the thing about the movie. What I was seeing, right, was characters, people on screen playing out certain actions. They were taking certain actions, they were playing certain roles, and something about what they did and how they did it and how the movie was arranged all together, including sometimes, the music, which is a part of it, really got to me. But the thing was, it got to exactly the part of me that needed it. So let me try to make this as clear as I can so I can draw the link between how this is useful to you in your daily life. When I watched the movie, right, the resonance that I felt was tied specifically to certain actions. And so those actions, right, when I started thinking about it after the fact, because this is one of the first times I became obsessed with this topic and started really studying it from a lot of different perspectives, one of the things that you're noticing is specific actions the characters are taking. So they do something specific and you feel something about it. And that's odd because they're just doing things. But you can tie those things to certain traits that they possess. You can tie them to values. So in this case, it was bravery for me. Broadly speaking, if I had to put one word on it, it was bravery. So the main character, I won't give any spoilers, but the main character is faced with lots of challenges. She lives in a very tumultuous situation, and she has to get through it, but she displays kind of a grit and a courage, right? She stands up in the face of that challenge. And watching her do that really was inspirational to me. And it was even more like idiosyncratic than that. It was like not just bravery, but it was bravery in a certain way, in a certain situation. And as I watched the movie, those situations started to say something to me. And what I realized was that they were telling me not just what I respected, right? Not just that I think bravery is good. Everybody thinks bravery is good. What they were telling me was, you think bravery is very important, and then immediately the next thought that a person has to have in those situations is, where's the place I'm not being brave? What's the thing that I'm avoiding? If it's bravery. Sometimes it's not bravery, sometimes it's gratitude. Sometimes it's humility. People pull their own values out of whatever story they're watching. And so when you're watching the story, what you're pulling out of it is not a generic thing, even if everybody's having a similar emotional reaction. What you're pulling out is about you, and it actually tells you what you value. What you value tells you how to get inspired, because it tells you what direction you have to move in. It gives you that motive force I was talking about that helps you make decisions, as Disney said. So, how does this apply to everyone here? I think that what I mentioned earlier about the nomad community and the tech community in general, outside of here, is what I was saying was that they're very nonfiction focused. So whenever I talk to people, I'm always surprised because I'm a huge movie buff. I'm like a cinephile, so I'm always just like, you see this movie? Did you see this movie? And like people are always like, no, I didn't see that movie. A few of you guys said yes, you saw a piece of something wild, so that's great. But in general, I find that most people in the nomad community are more interested in the next nonfiction book, what they can get from that book. And I think that that's useful, and it obviously gives you a lot of information you can use. But that's only one side of the equation, right? Because there's the world of moving forward in profession. There's the world of what I have to do to advance myself in the arena of career or in the arena of life. But I think that there's the other side of that story, which is that without inspiration, you can't push against the fear that helps you move forward. And so without a story that makes sense to you, that tells you about your values, you don't actually get access to the most important thing that tells you what you need to do. And so I think a lot of times when people are looking for a life coach, what they're looking for is, they're looking for an inspirational story, and they're looking for that person to help them find it, or to tell them what it is, which is a disastrous thing to do. But what they're really looking for is someone who can give them something that will inspire them, that will get them over that next hurdle. So what I think is that fiction has a power that's very often unrecognized. And I think that if you look to it,
sorry guys.
it's all right, you saw a picture for long enough. I think if you look to fiction with a keen eye, and if you start to really dig into what it's telling you, that it actually has as much information as nonfiction. I think that it can tell you all the things, it can tell you a lot about what you're actually missing when you're not looking in that specific place. And if you learn to do it well, it tells you that without you even trying. So nowadays, whenever I'm watching anything, movies or reading a book or consuming any type of fiction, involuntarily, I get glimmers of what it is that's important from that thing to me. And it tells me actually where to go. Because I realize that by denying that, by not going in the direction that my inspiration pushes me in, I'm setting myself up for the kind of existential crisis that we're probably all familiar with. You know, at some point in your life, you're sitting around, you're saying, I don't know what I'm doing or why I'm doing it. And that feeling can only be mitigated by a story that's inspiring enough. And so I say watch more movies and get in touch with stories, because it can help you be your own life coach. And that's pretty much the end of the presentation. But I'd like to answer questions if you got any. Yeah.
You say you consume a lot of fiction, like movies and books. Do you do it in a particular way, or you just read all kinds of stuff and try to have a very broad approach to that?
I'm pretty indiscriminate, or at least I used to be. I've just always been fascinated by fiction of all kinds, and I didn't realize why. You know, that's another weird thing. Why are people paying billions of dollars, literally billions, to go see like the Avengers? You know, why are people? Yeah, like why are people binging on Netflix? Why did you guys watch the Game of Thrones finale?
Yeah.
So okay, no spoil. Neither did I. So no spoilers. No spoilers. Well, yeah. There you go. Majority of people did, right? And it's not just Game of Thrones, right? But it is some stories, right? We're all drawn to them in this strange way. And so I was always drawn to them in that way. And I guess when I first started, I was reading books that my sister had. And then eventually I started finding my own books. I got into science fiction and fantasy, and then I got into comic books and anime and manga, and then movies. So I've run the gamut of stories. Nowadays, I like to think that I have a more developed palette. So I watch probably less of a broad swath of things, but I don't have a specific approach. I just watch anything that calls out to me, you know? It sparkles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I found the talk to be very practical in a lot of ways. But like, I was reading something online the other day. It was like, when you want to do something, there's a to-do list. But then you can also do something called a not to-do list. And then that is also very effective. And are there any other things that people can add to their not to-do list to reach this point of finding like to avoid like stopping them from reaching inspiration?
Like injunctions, like don't do this.
Yeah.
Like 10
Like
commandments
sort of
style.
rules of thumbs, yeah. Rules of thumb, not like don't do
Yeah.
this. You know?
Well, I would say, you know, don't look for stories in places where there aren't stories. You know, like don't look to find your values in places where you are not inspired. You know, I think that if you're looking to sources, to outside sources that seem rational to you. You know, if you're saying, oh, you know what, the right thing to do is probably this. Everyone tells me this. my job's telling me this. Everything seems to be pushing me this direction. This is what I should do. But you don't feel anything about it. You don't see a story of how that gets you to be the person you want to be. I think that's a good way to put it, to think about it. Being the person you want to be. If whatever you're thinking of doing doesn't push you in that direction, don't do that. I mean, that's probably the biggest don't.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So in the way that you're explaining it, it seems to me that you're looking to find like a narrative, right? That would inspire you. But in what way would that would that narrative come as an obstacle to reach like practicality, like practical goals?
Right.
Right? Because
Yeah.
you might feel inspired to travel the whole world non-stop, you know?
Yeah.
And how
Anybody
can
know that
you do
one?
it?
Yeah.
Would that be a feasible life goal? How can you balance like everyday lives, like practical goals,
Yeah.
with just this kind of inspirational
Right.
narrative?
Well, that's the thing, right? So inspiration is so vague, it's so high level that it seems like it doesn't give you any information about what to do day to day. But it does. In fact, it's the only thing that gives you information about what to do day to day. And I think if you don't figure out the value structure, right? Or like you said, what is the thing that you want to do the most based on your values? If you don't figure that out first, then you definitely don't know what to do day to day. And so you spin around in circles. That's what people do all the time. So first things first, figure out what the goal is. You know, that's why I think that the primary thing of importance is to figure that out. And it does feel vague to a lot of us, especially because we're all doers. Like that list I put up of all the things that people like to do, like that we're good at, we're driven, hardworking, whatever. All that stuff doesn't really lend itself to you sitting back and saying, you know, what do I value? What inspires me? Like it's just a different mode of thinking. But once you have it, right, then what you have to start doing is actually putting a plan in place. Because you have to start identifying actions that are associated with what you value. And so this is actually something I teach in my course, which is taking your values, right, and then building them into your life. Because once you have the value, let's say bravery for me, right? Immediately it tells you where you're not being brave. You know, even as I say that, probably some of you are like, yeah, I value bravery. And then the next thought is, oh, I'm not being brave about that thing that I should be doing, right? So the next step is to figure out, oh, okay, well, how can you start to embody that trait in the day-to-day while also aligning that with where you want to go. So if you want to travel the world, you know, if you value like something that's associated with that, well, then that's a goal, but it has to start somewhere. And the place that has to start is at the most minuscule level. So I agree with you. You can't just start with it. You can't just have your inspiration and nothing else. You need inspiration and a plan. But without the inspiration, you don't get to form a plan, because the plan will only push you forward if it's towards something of value.
So you should have a set of goals that you should be able to fulfill, like step-by-step approach kind of thing? Is that what you're saying?
I would say you definitely need goals.
Okay.
I mean, you certainly need, everyone needs goals, right? But you need goals that are of enough emotional significance to you that they will keep you moving towards them. And that's why I say, like, you know, a lot of the people in Palo Alto, for instance, are setting goals that don't have that kind of motive force. They run up against a wall. They make enough money, and all they had as a goal was money. Or they run up with, like, you know, prestige, and they run up against a wall where they've got it. Now what? So you kind of need something that will sustain you further than those things, and that has to do, I think, with your values. So here and then.
Do you find it easier to have like values for different areas, like profession, business, personal values, friends, social area?
Personally, I think that, you know, bravery was one example I gave, but bravery is a component of a set of values. And that set of values is best embodied, best envisioned as a personality. It's a person. It's, you know, it's a story of a person outside of myself. It's a character. This is why my course is called the character arc, because when you figure out what the components are of your character, then it tells you something about what you need to do to bring yourself into alignment with it. And so it's not that I don't have separate things for work or for personal life. I have a vision that gets clearer and clearer the more I practice this, of who I want to be. And that includes what I do for work. And that includes what kind of friends I have. That includes how I interact with my family and what my relationship looks like. And so yeah, that's what I do. sorry, Naya, you've been having your hand up for a little bit too.
Well, I
didn't
just
know that.
wanted to add to both your Ruth comment and to what you just said. I find it quite interesting how you use stories in movies, especially to get inspiration. I think another way to put it is also to look at it in like in corporate terms. They would probably say that you have a vision, right? And your value system correlates to your vision. That's your big star. That's where you're aiming for. While the goals are your mission, right? You set some goals, and that's where you want to reach, and combine your vision, your value system to achieve those goals. I don't know. Just wanted to add, but I also want to add that I find value system can be flexible in terms of they can change.
Oh yeah.
So it's not just like something that is fixed. That's something that, oh, my 4 core value system is consistency, empathy, or whatever you choose that are, they can change over time with your goals
Yeah.
and priorities in life.
Yeah.
And of course, the inspiration.
I agree. Yeah, they need constant updating, and that's why I think it's as you go through life, the story what calls out to you in stories changes. You know, you watch something when you're 10, and a certain part of it is like, ooh, wow. Then you get older, and that part you don't care about that part at all. But a different part is like calling out to you, and so it really is like interesting because it naturally happens. All you have to do is just watch it and pay attention to yourself. So.
Yeah, I like this approach to see the power of stories because I mean they obviously connect us to our feelings.
Yeah.
Where it's very easy to feel like a hero after watching a movie, where it's quite difficult to get super thrilled about watching a to-do list, right?
Yeah.
So it's probably if we could get into this vibe of yes, I'm doing this because, and then we look at this to-do list and we go crazy about it, that would be like the ultimate state. So if there would be only task on it where we say like, yeah, this is driving my mission, this is what I want to do. So I like this idea. So I wanted to ask you, how do you surround yourself with stories and how do they help you in your life or in your vision, or how do you use them to kind of change your mood, or I don't know, how do you use storytelling for your personal development?
Yeah. Well, you know, the story I told about this movie was one of the first times that I realized that I had been fascinated with stories long before I saw that movie, but I started realizing that maybe there was some utility to it also, because I felt that the emotion was so strong and it was telling me something so clearly that I was like, okay, this is something that I need to research more, like dig into a little more. And so I have a technique that I use in my course I call it smart streaming, because it's alliterative, people like that. But it's basically just a way of watching films, or you can do it with books, things like that. But it's a way of interacting with stories, because I think you interact with stories because they're doing something to you at the same time as you're watching them. And so, honestly, whenever I'm feeling uncertain about my directions or about what I want to be doing, which happens occasionally, right? Because that happens to everyone, because we always need to be updating our values. And like what mattered to me even last year might be slightly different than what it is now. But if I look at the stories that I'm watching, because I'm constantly watching stories, so for me it's easy, because I'm constantly watching stories. And so as I'm watching them, I'm always paying attention, and I always notice when they're doing something to me that I'm unfamiliar with. And so it's kind of like I'm using this technique that I developed, which is basically saying, so I was watching, what was I watching? I was watching this horror movie a little while ago. I pointed to Jane because I told her this story already. I was watching this horror movie and I saw a character in the movie say something offhand. And the thing is, it's never like these big emotional scenes. It's not when the music swells. It's like these little small scenes usually for me. There was a character who said something offhand that was another bravery thing. But as soon as he said it like I felt something. And so I paused the movie. I pause the movie and I dig into it immediately. If it's deep enough and I need to, and it's not immediately obvious to me what it is, then I pause and I start to dig into it a little bit. And I have a technique that I use for doing that. And by doing that, it helps me update my values. It helps me recognize where it is that I'm stepping off of whatever the path is I want to be on. And so for me, it's just kind of a constant updating of that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Would you say that discipline is a very important part of the equation for yourself and for others?
I guess it depends. Yes, for sure. Discipline is I guess it's a pretty broad question. Discipline is very necessary to get anything done because you have to do something for a long enough time for it to bear fruit.
I mean for inspiration purposes.
Oh, for inspiration purposes.
Like, do you have like a system? Like every week I gotta watch 3 movies.
Yeah, I do, but it's not because of. Yeah, I just do because I love watching movies.
That you just get my inspiration fix.
Well, so I mean, the thing is, if you're not a person who's drawn to film,
Right.
like so for in my course, I have it's a 5-week course, and so each week I basically prescribe a movie, and so they basically take that movie on and dissect it the way that I've discussed. And so a lot of people aren't as big into fiction as I am, so they may only watch a few movies a year. And so for those people, especially if they're feeling very out of sync with what their values are, it's very helpful to have that prescription. But it really depends on the person. I mean, there's some of you who probably watch a movie a week, or already on your own. But if you don't, then maybe there is some discipline that goes along with it, like actually structuring the exercise, because it is an exercise.
Thank you.
So.
So I kind of am at the opposite end. Like I'm coming from the perspective that I do find inspiration a lot in whatever it may be, like in just day-to-day life. I would love for you to just talk about like how you went from inspiration to actually like motivation to like the process, like went through to become a life coach and like move your career in a different way that you had initially set out.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm not technically a life coach, but I get your question. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
when I left my course is basically the way that I position it is that it helps people to get over the hurdle that they're facing, right? So that when they're in a trap, it helps you take your next big step. So that's like that's kind of the biggest piece of it. And for me, that's been something that consistently using these techniques has helped me do. And so the process looks something like what I described earlier, where I watch something, it tells me something about what matters to me, and then I like to make systems. I'm kind of a system creator, not for like computers or anything like that. I just am good at taking lots of complex information and trying to distill it into like what is a step-by-step way of progressing and moving forward. And so I just do that. And so I take that inspiration, I say, okay, this is fear of leaving my job. That's a big one, or it was for me at a certain point. And I'm not one of those people who's always like, you gotta quit your job, chase your passion. Sometimes your job is great and it's just you that needs updating. Or maybe your job isn't that great, but you could stay inside of it and leverage it to do something else in the future. I don't think you don't have to always jump off a cliff. But for me, at the point where I was in my last job, when I decided to step off and do this, what this helped me do, this technique and this process helped me do was to say, okay, now I know exactly what it is I value. And it has nothing to do with what I'm doing right now, professionally speaking. And so I started making a plan. So the first step was to say, well, what is it that you want to be doing? And I started looking at what I admired, right? What I valued. And all those things started telling me what direction I needed to move in. And it wasn't perfect. Right? I mean, it's never perfect. It's always a process, like Naya was saying. And so I just kind of been veering. But the thing is, when you're veering without the end goal, you just kind of veer all over.
Yeah.
You don't ever go anywhere. Whereas I've been veering towards, and as I've done that, my life has gotten better each time. And every time I'm always staying in contact with the stories that inspire me. So there's like a lot of nitty gritty in there that I'm not digging into, but you kind of get the overall picture, I guess. Does that help answer your question? Yeah.
Do you, first of all, your story is totally relatable because I just quit Apple.
Oh, cool.
So thank you for the, in Cupertino, yeah.
Oh, cool, we should talk after.
Yeah, I'll talk, but the question I had was that, so when you, for example, like with your, the trait of bravery that you discussed, and you said that it was almost kind of like, this is kind of my word to make this right, it was kind of like something that you're lacking or something in a way or something you're desiring. Do you ever find that same thing that you, when you're watching a movie or a fiction or a story or something like that, that you connect onto something that is actually a big strength of yours that you can help to kind of build the whole character story, if that makes sense?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So like the one is kind of like something that's like a deficiency, but something else maybe.
Yeah.
Is there like another kind of side of the coin there that you sense when you're watching a movie or a story or something like that?
Yeah, I think there is, and I think it's a spectrum, right? Because when I say bravery was the trait, right? There were definitely, as with everyone's lives, places in my life where I was displaying bravery. You know, like there's always challenges, and like you're meeting some of them, but you're not meeting some of the others. And so for me, it's always the two sides of the coin. I'm seeing this trait that I recognize I'm embodying more than I used to, and so I get a swell of pride from that. But then I also see the other side, which is like I'm not where I could be.
Yeah.
I could do better, and it points me in the direction of where I could do better. So I focus more on that because I think I like to pat myself on the back for what I've done, but I also want to make sure that I don't rest on my laurels, so to speak, when it comes to trying to become who it is I want to become. And so yes, you're exactly right. Like sometimes I see something in a movie and I'm like, you know what, that's exactly the right way to do that. I think I would do it probably the same way, and it's inspiring in that way. But there's always a little kernel, a little seed that says like, yeah, but.
Yeah.
So.
Something more. Yeah.
Yeah, like but next time you come up against that situation, you want to keep doing it.
Yeah.
And that's the important piece for me. Yeah.
Thank you very much, guys, and thank you, Kemet, for this awesome talk. I encourage you to follow Kemet on thecharacterarc.com because he has an awesome podcast, and you can follow his journey in the future as well, and also check out his course.
Yeah.
And we're gonna be here a while, so if you have other questions, don't hesitate to speak with him.
There's actually the technique I was talking about, the smart streaming. I have a guide. It's just a free guide that you can get for it at my website. It's thecharacterarc.com. That's ARC, A-R-C, not A-R-K. So if you're interested in seeing what kind of goes into that process that I described, you can get that free guide.
Also, you will probably meet Kemet at our Thursday meetups because he usually comes to the meetups as well. And thank you very much for joining today.
Yeah, thanks everyone.